that, because we have seen what the dichotomy is. It's either you feel there's enough to go around, or you don't. Regardless of which is true, objectively speaking, that's the dynamic we deal with. There are people who believe that they have to have more than others because zero-sum mental model, and there are those who don't. And I've heard psychologists talk about it, that you can get into like anything, you can overdose on that belief, and then you get. I'm not saying Donald Trump has this psychology, but there are people who they can never have enough houses. They can never have enough. It's like an bottomless need.
I think that you're talking about the rich countries, because if you go to other countries, if you go to India or Cuba or Nigeria, countries that I've been to, it's a very different mentality. It's not the same kind of greed. I mean, it exists, but it's not to the degree that I experience here in this country.
Yeah. Well, like I said, we'll get into at a later date the dynamic of that dichotomy and how we deal with it.
It's a hypocrisy.
But you've seen, say again?
It's a hypocrisy of privileged group, like where American or developed country just build up a so-called world system, which rules actually is the rules are very unfair, and then basically it's not about whether we have enough thing, but rather the rule is working so one-sided, which makes the rich country more richer, and then we don't care, people in the rich country don't care about having Chinese rural population, and that kind of mentality. That's really the biggest problem.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that there's been a fundamental change, not necessarily in my lifetime, but in the lifetime of my grandparents, from like the certain base principles or understanding of simple things like home ownership or the value of owning something. Home ownership in itself is a valuable thing, yet somehow the pedestrian idea of having a place and owning that roof over your head, there's been a disconnect between the investment vehicles and this idea of profiting from. So there's a very complex thing that we're all experiencing right now, where it has been, recompartmentalized and resold to something that no one even knows what it exists. But there's a very simplistic thing that I think has evolved in the mind of people of my generation, which is home ownership is a way to profit from something or to grow, and it's not it's a very different thing. And I think understanding how to recommunicate the value of something in itself versus the value of breaking it apart and trying to profit immensely from it is something that might need to change or be addressed.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to move to the next slide. Again, this is a fascinating discussion of dynamics that we can have a whole session on at some point. The thing I want to point to is that the degree to which these beliefs go unexamined, they are why human society is headed off a cliff. The contrast between two coexisting realities, the scarcity reality and the abundance reality, depending upon which group you dialogue with, is it's like it's like a frozen machine. You can't both go forward and reverse at the same time. You explode your transmission in your car. And what we are dealing with right now is the transition between those two belief systems, based on my research. Not that the people in one belief system are wrong, and the other belief system are right, but there's this transition, just like from an evolutionary perspective, when you had fish and you had animals. The fish were not better than the land animals were not better than the fish. They just had different capabilities. And then, of course, there were the amphibians that could coexist, that could exist in both environments. And so you can actually exist in that scarcity zero-sum reality. You can exist in the abundance reality. But if there is a capability that one offers that the other doesn't, then we get to have a choice. And again, it's not about, I really don't like using good or bad. It's just what do we want? You know, we've lived for centuries with the rich man, poor man reality. And we kept that in place, sometimes by force, sometimes by other means. But something has happened. Hello. You read the newspapers. The economic collapse has gotten so global so quickly that even Paul Volcker was just quoted the other day as saying, this is potentially more serious than the Great Depression. That's where the thinking is starting to go. And of course, Bill Clinton was just in the news saying, wait a minute, we need to throttle back on all the doom and gloom. And I can understand where he's coming from also, because the fact is, if you are at work on the machinery of our economic crisis, the housing value problem, the bank lending problem, that may not be suffice if the psychology starts to go out of whack, which is why I found it so interesting that last Friday on the PBS NewsHour, when Shields and Brooks were having their weekly summary, they touched on the psychology quite significantly, with David Brooks saying, we call it an economic crisis, but it's a psychological crisis. People don't have trust in the banks don't have trust in each other, but primarily people don't have trust in the future. And if you don't have trust in the future, why should you invest? Why should you spend? And then Mark Shields responded, the American people must believe their government can create and help to repair the institutions that we can unleash that American capacity again. And not sounding too chauvinistic or jingoistic, but I mean the American imagination, the American risk-taking, all of which have been hampered by the conditions that the president has inherited. So we have a crisis of confidence where the facts are serious, but it's becoming clear that it's not enough just to deal with the facts. There has to be some sort of effort made, and of course people look to Barack Obama to address that psychology. There was another part in that discussion on Friday where they called the president he's usually seen as the commander-in-chief. He was being called the
Preacher-in-chief or something?
preacher-in-chief. It has something to do with soothing our fears, or psychologist-in-chief, something like that, therapist-in-chief. You know, there is a element of his job that he may not even have recognized, and maybe Bill Clinton bringing it up will have him pause to think, oh, maybe I do need to, because we elected him based on hope. So there is a way to address this, but it's not by just looking at the mechanics, because looking at the mechanics is literally the firefighting part. We talked about this 2 weeks ago.